Hey, Father Muir here at Catholic Breakfast. Welcome. Doing a little series here on Abraham, which I'm calling The Call of Abraham and the Messiness of Life. And this is part 2. Thanks for joining me. In part 1, we looked at how the call of Abraham stands for the transcendent voice of God calling us for God's purposes in our lives. And how for us as secularized people that tend to think that God's voice never comes to us, that's really a liberation, that God can speak from outside His creation into us to call us for God's purposes. In step 2, I want you to see what happens next to Abraham as he responds and how that may surprise us and help us. The first thing really that Abraham does after he gathers up his family and starts to move to this land that God says He will show to Abraham, he builds an altar there and offers sacrifice. We make progress towards the goal of God in our lives really in the measure that we make God the focus of our worship. You know, what does worship mean? It means that which is of highest worth to you. Everybody worships something, even people who aren't religious. And you can tell basically everything you need to know about a person by what he or she worships. What you worship, the most worthy thing in your life, is what you will order everything else around your life to that. Maybe money is the thing of most worth in your life. You will sacrifice for that. Everything else will be at the service of that. Maybe it's a good reputation. Maybe it's your family. Maybe it's a comfort. So whatever that thing is you worship, you'll order everything else around that. Abraham built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to Abraham. So he's making this fundamental decision. I'm going to order all the things in my life, the created things in my life, towards the one who is not created, the one who is the source of all things. And now, what's the next thing that happens to Abraham? Everything goes great, right? When you start to worship God, when you make a decision to make God, the will of God, the fundamental thing of most worth in your life, everything goes great, right? Well, let me read to you Genesis chapter 12, verse 10. After Abraham worships God. Now there was a famine in the land. What's a famine? Not enough. There's not enough. There's not enough food. And that can be for all sorts of reasons, right? Nature somehow isn't supplying enough or is attacking. There's COVID-19, right? Or maybe there's cultural and political reasons. The human society, with its malice and deceptions, has turned on Abram and the place he's living, and that can certainly cause famines. That's a cause for a lot of famines today, right? Political injustice. And Abraham's got to move. Imagine you're Abraham here, right? Okay, God, you've called me on this adventure. You've called me to take everything and to worship you with everything I have in my life. And now there's not enough food to go around. Why is that? Let me quote to you here very wise Jesuit who I had when I was in seminary, Father Ralph Drendel. And I remember him saying to me one time, you know you're following God's will in your life when you experience the cross. And the heavier the cross, the more you know you're following God's will. Of course, I'm reading to you from the Old Testament. That's a reference to the New Testament, right? Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me. And if you don't, you can't be my disciple. What's the cross? Well, one way to read it is it's a kind of famine. It's a lack. It's not enough. There's not enough justice there. There's physical and natural torture. And remember on the cross, Jesus says, I thirst, right? So there's a kind of famine-like quality to the cross. Well, why in the world would it be of any use to Abraham to experience famine? It's the same question in the New Testament. Why in the world would Jesus ever think of it's a benefit for us to take up the cross? Go back to Abraham here. What's the very next line? Or it's actually the second half of this line. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. Now that we've established that once we make God the focus of our life and we start to worship Him, we can start to experience actually deprivations. But what it does for Abraham is it causes him to move. Now, what's God's plan for us? It's for us to become happy. He wants us to be made perfect, to be made happy. That's God's plan for us. God isn't He's not torturing Abraham so that God can get something out of it. God needs nothing. He's the source of all goodness. He's perfection itself. But he's inviting Abraham into God's plan so that Abraham can be happy, and through Abraham, other people can be blessed too. The going into Egypt stands for our movement into new places. Spiritually challenged, physically challenged, intellectually challenged. As Catholics, we believe that we're meant to cooperate in God's plan for our life. And you only really grow in the measure that you're challenged. If you've ever been into a sport, you know that's true. You just don't get any better at a sport unless you're right on that edge of where you feel like you're not going to make it through. You're lifting weights. You feel like you are weaker than you were before. In fact, in some ways, after you lift heavy weights, you are weaker. When you're reading a book and you're struggling with something intellectually, in philosophy, in theology, or in any academic discipline, it's hard. You're being pushed. Why is God pushing Abraham in this famine? Because he wants Abraham to grow. And a lot of difficulty is going to ensue. He's going to experience this famine. He's going to go to a place where he doesn't speak the language. He's going to be engaged in wars and battles. Family members are going to get kidnapped. He's going to struggle with infertility with his wife. And God, through it all, is inviting him to grow, because God's will for him is that he becomes happy. And without that challenge, which God himself is managing, carefully managing at every step of the way, even when it seems like it's out of control to Abraham, it's all for Abraham's good. So, like Abraham, I think the grace to ask God for is, Lord, help me when there's a famine in my life, when there's something where it's not enough. Help me to move into those places where it's difficult and challenging. Help me not to run away, but help me to move to the new place you desire me to go. That's an extremely important part of worshiping God. Things don't get easier when we decide to worship God. They can actually get more difficult because God wants us to grow for our own benefit. God bless you.